It can be maintained that no ancient philosopher devoted greater emphasis to the study of the soul than Plato. For this reason, any examination of his philosophy and its connections to Orphism appropriately begins with an analysis of his psychological doctrine. Within his works, the term soul appears more than 1,000 times, occurring most frequently in the middle and later dialogues such as the Phaedo, the Republic, and the Laws. However, even earlier writings like the Apology and the Gorgias already contain the essential principles of his psychology, particularly the immortality of the soul and its superiority over the body. This demonstrates that the nature and well-being of the human soul remained a central concern throughout his entire philosophical career. The significance of the theory of the soul in his philosophy extends far beyond ethics and practical thought, reaching into metaphysics and epistemology. The human soul, due to its kinship with the perfect and unchanging entities known as forms, serves as a link between the intelligible realm of these forms and the sensory world in which they appear. Without this connection, human knowledge would not be possible. Across his writings, the soul is approached from multiple angles, depending on the focus of each dialogue or specific section. This diversity has led some scholars to question whether his psychological theory is fully consistent, particularly given the apparent differences between an indivisible and immortal soul described in the Phaedo and the tripartite soul outlined in the Republic and the Timaeus, where only the rational component is considered immortal. Many of these interpretative challenges can be addressed by taking into account the complex cultural influences that shaped his views. In particular, two contrasting models can be identified, one traditionally associated with Homeric thought, and another aligned with Orphic ideas. By comparing these perspectives with his own, it becomes possible to see how he selectively adopted certain elements, rejected others, and integrated them into a new framework. This synthesis ultimately produced an original understanding of the soul that would influence later developments in both psychology and the philosophy of mind well into the modern period. The notion that human beings consist of two distinct aspects, a visible and physical body through which interaction with the external world occurs, and an invisible soul or mind responsible for consciousness and thought, may appear familiar today because of its deep roots in Western religious and philosophical traditions. However, this distinction was not present in early Greek thought. Prior to the 5th century before Christ, available evidence suggests that Greek culture did not clearly separate body and soul as fundamentally different entities. Indeed, the language itself reflects this absence. In Homeric Greek, there were no direct equivalents for the modern concepts of body and soul. The term later used to mean body originally referred specifically to a corpse, while the word associated with soul appeared only in contexts involving the loss of consciousness, such as death or fainting. This does not imply that Homer lacked terms to describe the body and soul of the living, but rather that he did not regard them as two distinct entities. In his view, the body and soul of a living person are inseparably connected. Only at the moment of death do they become divided, and in that separation their nature changes so significantly that they are referred to by different names. This understanding is reinforced by the range of expressions used to describe mental and emotional life in Homeric language. Most of these terms refer either to physical parts of the body, such as the chest or the heart, or to processes associated with bodily functions, such as breath or spirit, while mind stands as a notable exception. For Homer, and likely for those of his time, the body and the mind operate as a unified whole that defines personal identity. A person does not possess a body or a soul as separate components. Rather, body, mind, and self are fundamentally one and the same. By the 5th century before Christ, however, a significant shift can be observed in how the self and its physical and mental aspects are described. The terms for body and soul come to denote the body and soul of a living individual, now clearly understood as separate entities. At the same time, personal identity, no longer grounded in the unity of body and soul, becomes associated primarily with consciousness or the soul. Early signs of this transformation appear in thinkers such as Heraclitus, who describes those misled by their senses as having barbarian souls, and in the writings of the orator Antiphon, who suggests that even if a person's body fails, the soul endures, strengthened by awareness of its innocence. In Plato's philosophy, this distinction becomes even more pronounced. Body and soul are not only separate, but possess opposing characteristics and tendencies, placing them in fundamental conflict with one another. This perspective is already visible in the Apology, where care for the soul is contrasted with concern for the body and material possessions. It reaches a more radical expression in the Phaedo, where philosophy is described as the practice of death. In this context, death is understood as the separation of the soul from the body. The soul, if it has remained pure and avoided attachment to bodily influences, departs free from the body and moves toward what is invisible, divine, immortal, and wise. In such a state, it is released from ignorance, fear, and human suffering, and exists thereafter among the gods. Within this framework are contained several central elements of Plato's theory of the soul. Death is the division of body and soul, which are essentially different in nature. Human identity is located in the soul, while the body serves merely as a vessel. The soul, being immortal and akin to the divine, continues to exist beyond the body and, if purified, ascends to a higher realm where it remains eternally. Achieving this purity requires a life devoted to philosophy and a deliberate distancing from bodily concerns, which are seen as obstacles or even sources of corruption for the soul. Although certain aspects of this view, such as the distinction between body and soul, were widely accepted in Plato's time, the strong devaluation of the body was far less common. Most people of the period would not have regarded the body or human existence as something to transcend, yet such an idea would likely have resonated with adherents of the religious movement known as Orphism. In a well-known passage from the Cratylus, Socrates remarks that certain individuals of his time described the body as the tomb of the soul. He further suggests that this interpretation was especially associated with the followers of Orpheus, who understood the body as a kind of enclosure in which the soul is confined. According to this view, the soul undergoes punishment for a wrongdoing and is enclosed within the body so that it may be preserved or saved, much like a prisoner held within a cell. The identity of those referred to as some has long been a matter of scholarly debate. Certain interpreters equate them with the followers of Orpheus mentioned immediately afterward, while others argue that the reference is instead to the Pythagoreans. Those who favor the latter interpretation often rely on a fragment attributed to the Pythagorean thinker Philolaus of Croton, in which it is stated that ancient theologians and seers affirmed that the soul is bound to the body as a form of punishment and lies within it as though in a tomb. However, there is little reason to assume that these ancient figures were themselves Pythagoreans rather than earlier Orphic poets, especially when considering what is known about their respective traditions. Moreover, substantial evidence connects the idea of the body as the tomb of the soul specifically to Orphic thought. A fragment attributed to Aristotle reports that, within the teachings of the mysteries, the condition of the soul within the body resembles that of captives subjected to a cruel form of restraint, bound to lifeless bodies as a means of torment. The suggestion that the metaphors of the body as a tomb and as a prison must belong to different groups, on the grounds that they are incompatible, is weakened by ancient sources that present both images together. These include passages from Plato as well as the testimonies associated with Aristotle and Philolaus. In addition, the wording of the Platonic passage itself implies that the followers of Orpheus may have offered more than one explanation for the term used for the body, making it plausible that both interpretations coexisted within their tradition. It is also important to note that, in Attic prose, an expression referring to those around a particular figure commonly denotes the person's close associates or circle. This suggests that the reference is to the earliest adherents of Orphism, namely the founders of the movement and the authors of its ancient poems. According to this account, these early Orphics assign the name for the body primarily because of its function as an enclosing structure, one that confines the soul so that it may undergo punishment and ultimately achieve preservation in the afterlife. Setting aside, for the moment, the implications concerning the fate of the soul, this passage contains a noteworthy detail that has puzzled some interpreters: the suggestion that the very use of the term for the body in this sense originated with the early Orphics. If this claim is taken seriously, it lends support to the view proposed by some scholars that the Orphic tradition played a role in the shift in meaning of the terms for body and soul that occurred between the time of Homer and the 5th century before Christ. Plato's statement does not, of course, demonstrate that the use of the term for the living body truly originated with the Orphics, but only that he himself considered it to be so, unless one assumes that he was not being serious and simply invented the attribution, as he occasionally does in a playful manner elsewhere. Such an assumption, however, appears unlikely. Plato generally avoids explicitly naming Orpheus or the Orphics when presenting ideas closely aligned with his own, and therefore his deliberate mention of them in this context would represent a notable departure from his usual approach. In any case, it has been observed that it would have been natural for the Orphics to apply a term originally meaning corpse to the living body, since they regarded earthly life as a form of death and the death of the body as the beginning of true life, namely the eternal existence of the soul, at least for those who were initiated. Like Plato, the Orphics located human identity in the soul, understood as divine and immortal, rather than in the mortal body. A similar development can be traced in the use of the term for the soul, which, no longer restricted to the context of death, came to denote the living, embodied principle of life, and thus the bearer of vitality. When the passage in the Cratylus is reconsidered in light of these points, it becomes evident that Plato follows his usual method of referring vaguely to certain contemporaries, only introducing the name of Orpheus when he needs to speak specifically about the earliest adherents of the tradition. It also becomes apparent that the interpretation connecting the term for the body with preservation reflects Plato's own reworking of the Orphic image of the body as a prison. This is not because the interpretation contradicts Orphic beliefs, but because Plato presents it as his own understanding through careful phrasing. His expression indicates that what follows is a personal explanation of the principal reason why the Orphics used that term. In summary, Plato appears to have adopted from the Orphic tradition a dualistic conception of the human being, in which the soul, as the true essence of the individual, is confined within the body as if in a prison or even a tomb. Liberation of the soul requires purification, achieved either through initiation into religious mysteries or, in Plato's view, through the practice of philosophy. Both paths involve preparation for death by means of disciplined practices intended to shield the soul from the corrupting influence of the body, a process he describes as the practice of death. Although the superiority of the soul over the body remains a consistent principle throughout Plato's works, his account of the soul's exact nature and its relation to the body appears to evolve. In earlier dialogues, the soul is typically portrayed as a single, unified entity, capable of existing independently and defined in contrast to the body. In later works, however, this simple opposition is replaced by a more complex picture, in which the tension between body and soul is mirrored within the soul itself as a conflict among its different parts. In this evolution of ideas, Plato overturns the usual way of thinking about the relation between body and soul. It is not that the soul is identical with the body, nor simply that the two are entirely separate. Rather, it is more accurate to say that all things are rooted in soul. The soul does not arise from the body or depend on it for existence. On the contrary, the body, and indeed the whole material world, exists because the soul makes it possible. In this philosophy, reality itself is ensouled. In the Timaeus, Plato describes the world's soul as composed of being, sameness, and difference, forming the most fundamental structure of existence. This world's soul mediates between the realm of being and the realm of becoming, linking the world of forms, marked by permanence and perfection, to the material world, characterized by change and decay. To grasp the full force of this view, one might say that the realm of becoming lacks true existence in itself. It is a domain of passing appearances, while genuine life belongs to the higher realm. Thus, the realm of being, the forms, and the soul provide reality to the world of becoming. What appears as the material universe is, in comparison, like a dream. In this sense, the whole cosmos may be understood as a living soul, and everything within it as expressions of that soul. Even when speaking of the body, one is referring to a fleeting manifestation within this greater, ensouled reality. An early indication of this later model can be found in a passage from the Gorgias, where the soul of a person ruled by desires is compared to a leaking vessel. In this account, it is suggested that human beings are, in a sense, already dead, and that the body functions as a tomb. The part of the soul associated with appetites is described as unstable and easily influenced, and is likened to a container that cannot hold what is poured into it. Those lacking understanding are compared to the uninitiated, and their souls to a sieve that cannot retain anything because of forgetfulness and disbelief. This imagery conveys the idea that such individuals are condemned to a state of perpetual dissatisfaction, endlessly attempting to fill what can never be filled, and thus experiencing a condition of misery even in the realm of the unseen. It is useful to begin by noting several significant parallels between this passage and the one from the Cratylus. To start with, both texts allude to the Orphic notion of the body as the tomb of the soul, although neither explicitly attributes this idea to the Orphics. In addition, each passage distinguishes between an older source, possibly preserved in written form, such as a clever Sicilian or Italian in one case and the followers of Orpheus in the other, and a more recent, undefined oral source, referred to as one of the wise men, or simply some people. Furthermore, both passages rely on the same interpretative technique, namely allegorical explanation grounded in wordplay and associations between related terms, as well as similarities in sound. This approach is also characteristic of the interpretative method found in the Davini Papyrus, where an Orphic poem is explained through comparable strategies. The connection to Orphic thought in the passage from the Gorgias is further reinforced by the reference to the myth of the water carriers, associated with Orphic and Eleusinian traditions, which underlies the image of the leaking vessel. This resemblance has led some scholars to propose that Plato may have drawn the allegory from an interpretative tradition linked to ancient Orphic poetry. While this hypothesis is plausible and supported by notable similarities, it is perhaps more likely that Plato himself devised the allegory, while indirectly attributing it to the author of the myth concerning the punishment of the water carriers, much as he later does in the Cratylus with his interpretation of the term for the body. A key reason for this view is that Plato assigns to his supposed source certain ideas about the nature of the soul that clearly reflect his own thinking, particularly the notion that desires belong to a distinct part of the soul and that this element obstructs the pursuit of wisdom. Although it cannot be determined with certainty whether Plato had already fully developed the concept of a tripartite soul at the time of composing the Gorgias, it is reasonable to conclude that he was moving in that direction. This leads to what is generally regarded as Plato's most significant contribution to psychology, the theory of the tripartite soul. Introduced in the fourth book of the Republic, this theory proposes that the human soul consists of three distinct parts: the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. These correspond to the three classes within the ideal state: rulers, warriors, and producers. The rational element, situated in the head, is oriented toward knowledge and truth and is responsible for governing the other parts. The spirited element, associated with the chest and inheriting characteristics of earlier conceptions of emotional force, encompasses a wide range of feelings, from anger to courage, and supports reason in restraining the appetites. The appetitive element, located in the lower region of the body, is concerned with desire and the pursuit of physical pleasure and material satisfaction. This theory has long been debated among scholars. Some have suggested that Plato was drawing upon earlier Pythagorean ideas about different modes of life, while others argue that he introduced the third element primarily to sustain the analogy between the structure of the soul and that of the state. A smaller group has questioned the coherence of the theory altogether, though most interpret it as a central feature of Plato's mature philosophy. Its importance is further confirmed by its presence not only in the Republic, but also in later works such as the Phaedrus and the Timaeus. While it is possible that the analogy with the structure of the ideal state initially inspired the division of the soul into three parts, Plato's continued use of this model suggests that it held a significance extending beyond its original political context. As for the possibility that the theory of the tripartite soul may have been influenced by earlier Pythagorean ideas, the absence of evidence from before Plato makes it impossible to determine whether the so-called theory of three lives shaped his thinking or whether the influence worked in the opposite direction. Later sources report that the Orphics also told a myth concerning three races of human beings, which might have contributed to the development of Plato's theory. Yet, as with the Pythagorean material, the lack of early testimony prevents any firm conclusion from being drawn. A more plausible explanation is that Plato brought together the Homeric view of the embodied soul as a combination of various psychological functions with the dualistic framework inherited from Orphism. The distinction between body and soul was central to Orphic belief, but the image of the body as a prison suggests a more complex understanding, one that acknowledges within the human soul an imperfect or even corrupt element alongside the divine aspect with which initiates identified. If the soul were entirely pure and divine, its confinement within a mortal body would be difficult to explain. It is therefore possible that the division between a rational and immortal component and an irrational and mortal one, found in Plato's later works, has some precedent in Orphic accounts of human origins, or at least in certain interpretations of them. In any case, the dual condition of the Platonic soul arises from the fundamental opposition between body and pure soul. The irrational and mortal aspect does not belong to the soul's true nature, but results from its involvement with the material world through embodiment. For this reason, the embodied soul is compared to a sea deity whose original form is concealed beneath layers of external matter. By further distinguishing within the irrational element between appetite and spirit, Plato makes use of earlier conceptions of emotional force to introduce a third component into his model. This addition allows him to connect the rational and appetitive elements and to account more fully for the range of human psychological experience. The belief in the immortality of the soul has been described as one of the two fundamental pillars of Plato's philosophy, the other being the theory of forms. Although references to the soul's survival after death appear in earlier works, the first structured argument for its immortality is presented in the Meno, in connection with the theory of recollection. Addressing the problem of how inquiry is possible when one does not already know what one is seeking, Socrates proposes that learning is in fact the recovery of knowledge that is already present within the soul. To illustrate this, he guides one of Meno's slaves through the solution of a geometrical problem by means of questioning. Since the slave is said to have had no prior instruction, the knowledge he displays must have been acquired before his present life, that is, before his soul entered the body. From this, it follows that the soul must be immortal. This argument has often been overlooked by commentators, who tend to regard it as philosophically weak or as a digression from the main discussion. Nevertheless, regardless of how the argument itself is evaluated, the notion of the soul's immortality, though only briefly addressed in this context, appears to have been a deeply rooted conviction for Plato, carrying significant implications for his religious, moral, and epistemological views. The religious importance of this entire passage is clearly emphasized by Socrates in what can be understood as the introduction to the argument from recollection. He explains that he has heard from men and women who possess wisdom in divine matters, including priests and priestesses who are able to give an account of their sacred practices. He also refers to Pindar and other inspired poets as authorities on these matters. According to these sources, the human soul is immortal. At one moment it comes to an end, which is called death, and at another it is born again, yet it is never destroyed. For this reason, they maintain that human beings ought to live their lives in the most pious and holy manner possible. From the outset, this passage recalls a similar one from the Gorgias, where Socrates likewise introduces a teaching by attributing it to one of the wise. Some scholars, comparing these instances with other places in Plato's works where the wise are mentioned, have suggested that this expression serves as an indirect reference to a specific group, whether the Orphics, the Pythagoreans, or perhaps both, without explicitly naming them. Although such a general designation could in principle apply to any authority Plato chose not to identify, there are additional reasons to think that the figures described here as knowledgeable in divine matters belong to the same cultural setting as the wise man mentioned in the Gorgias. In addition to the shared belief in the immortality of the soul and the cycle of rebirth, which is characteristic of both Orphic and Pythagorean traditions, Plato attributes to these individuals the ability to explain the meaning of their ritual practices. This detail finds a close parallel in a passage from the Republic, where certain itinerant figures are criticized for presenting collections of writings attributed to Musaeus and Orpheus in order to validate their teachings. Such a description aligns with what is known about Orphism, where sacred texts played a central role. An even closer comparison can be drawn with the author of the Divini Papyrus, who claims to interpret the deeper meaning of Orphic poetry and, more importantly, of the rituals performed by its practitioners. The mention of both men and women among these knowledgeable figures has sometimes been taken as evidence of a Pythagorean background, since that tradition is known to have included female members. However, the description of these individuals as priests and priestesses is more naturally suited to a religious context, such as Orphism, rather than to philosophical circles like those of the Pythagoreans. Although direct evidence for Orphic priestesses is limited, this absence is not especially significant given the fragmentary nature of the sources. What can be established, however, is that women were well represented among those initiated into Orphic rites, as indicated by the surviving evidence from ritual inscriptions. In the Meno, the doctrine of the immortal soul is first presented as a truth of religion, supported by the authority of wise priests and priestesses, as well as divinely inspired poets such as Pindar and, most likely, figures like Orpheus and Musaeus. Socrates fully accepts this teaching and proceeds to reinforce it through an empirical demonstration that serves to illustrate the theory of recollection, which is then followed by a more formal argument for the soul's immortality. In a similar way, in the Phaedo, the extended series of arguments in favor of the soul's immortality is introduced by references to doctrines associated with Orphic belief. The first of these appears when Cebes expresses confusion about why a philosopher should not take his own life if death is regarded as something desirable. In response, Socrates recalls having heard from Philolaus and from others that such an act is not permitted. He then refers to a teaching conveyed in the Mysteries, according to which human beings exist in a kind of confinement and must not free themselves or escape from it. This idea is described as profound and not easily understood, yet Socrates affirms at least one aspect of it, that the gods care for human beings and that humanity belongs to them. Because Philolaus, a Pythagorean philosopher, is explicitly mentioned among those who forbid suicide, some interpreters have attributed this prohibition primarily to the Pythagorean tradition. More recent studies, however, have identified the Orphics, implicitly included among the others mentioned in the passage, as the principal supporters of this belief. According to Plato, this prohibition is closely connected with the esoteric teaching that the body serves as a kind of prison for the soul, an idea explicitly linked elsewhere to the followers of Orpheus. As in other cases, Plato reshapes this inherited doctrine by offering his own interpretation, presenting it in a more positive light. Rather than emphasizing the punitive character of human existence, which in Orphic teaching is often explained as the consequence of an ancient wrongdoing, he focuses instead on the benevolent role of the gods as guardians of humanity. From this perspective, human beings are under divine care, and a wise person would not wish to abandon the service of such masters unless permitted to do so. It has been argued that this reference most likely points to the Orphic Mysteries, and more specifically to their esoteric teaching, namely the myth concerning the killing and dismemberment of Dionysus, the disclosure of which was probably restricted by religious taboo. The term used to describe the human condition in this context commonly signifies a form of guarding or watch, but it can also denote a place of confinement or a prison. Its use suggests an image of human existence as a kind of custody assigned by the gods, who oversee and care for human beings while they remain bound within the body. In other contexts, the same term is applied to a place of punishment in the afterlife, where souls atone for their wrongdoing. This parallel indicates that both the body and such post-mortem states may serve a similar purpose. They provide a setting in which the soul undergoes purification and pays the penalty required for its eventual salvation. The language employed also reflects a perspective in which human beings are identified primarily with their souls rather than with their bodies. Within this framework, the prohibition against taking one's own life is explained by the idea that individuals must not attempt to escape the consequences of their actions. Only those who properly atone for an ancient wrongdoing through the appropriate rites are granted release, after death, from the confinement of the body. In certain interpretations, this belief is further reinforced by the notion that humanity originates from beings who committed a primordial offense, and that self-destruction would in some sense repeat that original act. Whether or not this particular detail belongs to the earliest form of the tradition remains uncertain, yet it points to a more complex understanding of the body than is often assumed. From this perspective, the philosopher does not seek to hasten death, but instead accepts it when it arrives, trusting that it leads to a better state of existence among divine beings and among those who have lived more rightly. Achieving such a fate requires the purification of the soul, which involves distancing oneself from bodily pleasures and desires, since these are seen as obstacles to philosophical inquiry. Because death is understood as the separation of the soul from the body, the true practitioner of philosophy is described as one who devotes life to preparing for this separation, engaging in what is called the practice or exercise of death. This conception of the philosophical life closely resembles what is known about Orphic beliefs and practices, including their rejection of bodily excess, their disciplined way of living, and their emphasis on rituals connected with death. This connection is reinforced by another passage, where those who established the mysteries are portrayed not as naive figures, but as individuals who expressed profound truths in symbolic form. They taught that those who reach the afterlife without initiation remain in a degraded state, while those who arrive purified and initiated dwell among the gods. According to a traditional saying, many carry the ritual staff, but few truly achieve the state associated with divine possession. In this interpretation, those few are identified with individuals who have genuinely pursued philosophy in the proper way. It is known from Plato and other ancient testimonies that being cast into mud was considered one of the punishments awaiting the uninitiated in the afterlife within the Orphic and Eleusinian traditions. It is also well attested that Orpheus, at least from the later part of the 5th century before Christ, was regarded as the figure who introduced the mysteries to the Greek world. For this reason, there is little doubt that those described as the founders of the rites are to be identified with the originators of the Orphic cult. This interpretation is supported by later commentators, who maintain that Plato is drawing upon, or reworking, an Orphic poetic source. The meaning of the saying that many carry the ritual staff while few truly become inspired participants has been discussed since antiquity. A persuasive interpretation holds that the latter group represents the small number of initiates who genuinely attain and sustain a state of communion with Dionysus through disciplined practices, in contrast to the larger number who merely take part in the rituals without deep understanding or commitment. This reading aligns with the broader philosophical context in which the passage appears, namely the contrast between true philosophers and those who only claim to love wisdom while remaining attached to bodily concerns. The former, by overcoming their passions and rejecting the dominance of the body, achieve purification of the soul and are therefore able to face death with confidence, expecting the rewards of a virtuous life. The latter, however, refrain from certain pleasures only out of fear of losing others they still desire, and consequently approach death with anxiety, since their souls remain bound to the material realm. The form of purification described by Plato differs in important ways from that practiced in Orphic tradition. In Plato's case, purification is primarily moral and intellectual, whereas in the Orphic context it is largely achieved through ritual observance. Nevertheless, both share the same ultimate aim, the restoration of the soul to its divine condition and its reunion with the gods. Both perspectives also depart from the traditional Greek distinction between gods and human beings by proposing that humans consist of a mortal body and an immortal soul, the latter being the true seat of identity. Since immortality was closely associated with divinity in Greek thought, it follows that the Orphics, and to some extent Plato, could regard human beings as possessing a divine origin, striving to overcome their mortal limitations and return to a higher state of existence among gods and heroes. Even so, Plato does not fully equate the human soul with the divine. Instead, he tends to describe it as akin to or resembling the divine, especially when it is embodied, and often emphasizes its subordinate status. In Orphic ritual texts, however, initiates explicitly claim kinship with the gods and assert their right to a privileged position in the afterlife, separate from other souls. For this reason, the recurring comparison between philosophy and the mysteries in Plato's works should not be seen merely as a rhetorical device, but rather as reflecting a genuine affinity with Orphic ideas. Indeed, much of his philosophy can be understood as a reinterpretation of themes rooted in Orphic thought. The central portion of the Phaedo, with its extended argument for the immortality of the soul, provides a clear illustration of this transformation. A full analysis of these arguments would require more detailed discussion than is possible here, so only a brief overview of the main lines of reasoning, together with their connections to Orphic concepts, is offered. The first two arguments presented in the Phaedo revisit themes introduced in the Meno, specifically the related doctrines of reincarnation and recollection. The so-called cyclical argument provides a philosophical grounding for the ancient tradition that the souls of the dead are not dispersed like breath or smoke, but continue their existence in Hades, from where they eventually return to the earthly realm in an endless cycle. This recurring cycle of rebirth is presented as an expression of a universal principle according to which opposites give rise to one another. For example, life produces death and death produces life. The generation of opposites from opposites had been theorized by Heraclitus as part of his doctrine of flux, but such pairs of opposites also appear prominently in Orphic sources, including the Albia bone tablets dating to the 5th century before Christ. The second argument, known as the argument from recollection, reinforces the first by appealing to the existence of certain innate ideas, providing further evidence that the soul existed prior to birth. The third, or argument from affinity, maintains that the soul shares a greater kinship with the immutable forms than with its physical body, and thus can be expected to resemble the forms in its indestructibility. At this point, Socrates pauses the argument to offer a plausible account of the fate of souls after death. A soul that departs in a state of purity ascends to the invisible realm to dwell in the company of the gods, as described for the initiated, whereas a soul that departs polluted is drawn to the physical world, reincarnating in a body that reflects the character it exhibited in its previous life. Gluttonous souls as donkeys, tyrannical souls as wolves, virtuous but unphilosophical souls as bees, and eventually as moderate men. The fourth argument uses the principle of non-contradiction to demonstrate the soul's intrinsic immortality. Since the soul always imparts life to the body it inhabits, being alive is essential to its nature, and therefore the soul can never truly die, because two mutually exclusive properties cannot coexist in the same subject. The belief that human souls could transmigrate into animals, and possibly plants, was well known in the Orphic Pythagorean tradition, although, unlike in the Phaedo, the type of life form a soul would inhabit was apparently determined by chance according to surviving sources. At first glance, the account of the soul in the Phaedo seems difficult to reconcile with later dialogues, especially regarding the division of the soul into distinct parts, a possibility apparently rejected in the Phaedo, where the soul's indestructibility is explicitly linked to its simplicity. Yet on closer inspection, there are clear points of continuity. For instance, in the mythic digression between the third and fourth arguments, Socrates associates various animals with different human types determined by the predominance of one part of the soul: donkeys with the appetitive type, wolves, hawks, and kites with the spirited type, and bees, wasps, and ants with the rational type. The absence of an explicit mention of the three parts of the soul, as later elaborated in the Republic, may indicate that the theory was still in development, yet a conceptual distinction between the rational, spirited, and appetitive aspects was already present in Plato's thought. Another connection between the Phaedo and subsequent dialogues is found in the final argument for the soul's immortality, which closely aligns with the argument from motion presented in the Phaedrus. The final argument in the Phaedrus asserts that all soul is immortal because it is the source of motion in all moving things and is itself perpetually in motion. That which is always in motion is, by definition, immortal. This passage translates an argument about the relationships of words and concepts into one grounded in observable physical reality, for movement is the empirical sign of life. The precise meaning of all soul has been debated since antiquity. Posidonius understood it collectively, relating it to the world soul described in the Timaeus, while Harpocration read it distributively, as referring to every individual soul, including those of animals. Hermias, in his commentary, interpreted the phrase as all rational soul, reflecting Plato's earlier remark about understanding the nature of the soul, both human and divine. Modern scholars vary in their readings. Some treat it as soul in general, others as exclusively the rational soul, while some interpret it as a common aspect of all living beings. Although the main purpose of this section, including the subsequent eschatological myth, is to highlight the shared nature of human and divine souls, restricting all soul to the rational aspect would weaken the argument, as animals, which participate only in the irrational soul, are also capable of motion. Yet including the irrational soul under the label of immortality seems to contradict other passages that describe it as mortal. Book 10 of the Republic offers further clarification regarding the irrational soul. Observing that nearly everything possesses its own inherent flaw, and that all things except the soul are destroyed by this flaw, Socrates concludes that the soul, whose flaws are injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, and ignorance, must be immortal. It is evident that Plato here refers to the human soul in its tripartite form, as these congenital evils correspond to the opposites of the cardinal virtues explained through the tripartite psychology in Book 4. However, not all parts of the human soul share the same degree of immortality. Socrates acknowledges that it is difficult for a composite thing, especially one imperfectly constructed, to be eternal. The soul, when corrupted by its association with the body and its inherent evils, cannot reveal its true nature. Instead, one must contemplate it through reason as it exists in purity. In this state, the soul resembles the sea god Glaucus, whose original form is obscured by damage and accretions of shells, seaweed, and rocks, so that it appears more like a wild creature than its true nature. Such is the soul's condition, marred by countless evils. As the comparison with the barnacle-encrusted Glaucus clearly illustrates, the irrational parts of the soul, namely the spirited and appetitive components, do not reveal the soul's true nature, which is represented by the pure rational part. Instead, these irrational elements resemble external attachments the soul acquires through contact with the physical world via incarnation. While the soul as a whole, in all its parts, cannot die, only the rational soul, purified from its mortal encumbrances, is genuinely immortal and divine. This distinction is highlighted in the Timaeus, where the creation of the human soul is divided. The demiurge is responsible for creating the rational, immortal soul, while the younger gods create the spirited and appetitive parts, constituting the mortal soul. In the Phaedo, which focuses on the human soul in its purest state, the state the philosopher seeks to achieve, the arguments for immortality rely heavily on the contrast between soul and body. Difficulties emerge, however, when an argument intended to demonstrate the immortality of the human soul is extended to all souls without qualification, as seen in the argument from motion in the Phaedrus. The ambiguity of the term all soul appears to be intentional, serving to address the limitations of a purely impersonal view of the soul within Socrates' second speech. This enduring concern for the human soul and its immortal divine nature, which permeates the transitional and middle period dialogues, reflects the profound influence of the Orphic tradition on Plato's philosophical development, a connection that becomes even more evident when considering the centrality of eschatology in his mature thought. Eschatology is undoubtedly the area where the influence of Orphism and mystery religions on Plato is most visible. This influence is hardly surprising given the impact of Orphic myths and ideas on the ancient Greek conception of the afterlife, as seen not only in the works of poets such as Pindar and the dramatists, but also in popular visual arts like vase paintings. While most scholars acknowledge Plato's debt to Orphic thought in shaping his vision of the afterlife, the philosophical significance of his eschatological passages has long been debated. Because these passages often take a mythical form, some scholars have dismissed them as merely literary, decorative, or pedagogical tools for readers untrained in philosophy, incapable of following abstract dialectical reasoning. Others argue that Plato resorts to myth only when the subject matter surpasses the limits of dialectic, sometimes seen as a flaw in his method. Recent scholarship, however, has adopted a more nuanced perspective that moves beyond the rigid modern distinction between mythos and logos, recognizing Plato's use of myth as an integral part of philosophical discourse. Since the assumptions underlying Plato's eschatological vision, most notably that the human soul is immortal and undergoes cycles of reincarnation, are logically demonstrated in dialogues such as the Phaedo, the purpose of the eschatological myths is not to compensate for any weakness in dialectical argumentation. Rather, these myths strengthen the argument by harnessing the persuasive and illustrative power of traditional, particularly Orphic, imagery. Plato is able to move beyond the strict limitations of dialectic, going beyond what can be logically falsified, and offer a vivid and detailed account of what awaits the soul after leaving the body. This portrayal serves as a powerful incentive for the reader to embrace a philosophic life. It is significant that 3 of Plato's 4 major myths concerning the afterlife appear in the conclusion of his works, the section most crucial for imparting a lasting impression. The myth of the Gorgias is the shortest and, in terms of composition, the oldest of Plato's eschatological myths. Unlike the myths in the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Republic, it contains no explicit reference to reincarnation. This absence becomes understandable when the myth is considered in relation to its context and function within the dialogue. After failing to convince the young Callicles to prioritize the good of the soul through dialectic, Socrates appeals to emotion, recounting a story about the judgment of the dead to show that arriving in Hades with a soul weighed down by crimes is the greatest of all misfortunes. Although Socrates admits that the account has the appearance of a folk tale, he asserts his trust in its truth and repeatedly urges Callicles to accept it as credible. The presentation of the myth as something Socrates has heard from an unspecified source should not be seen as an attempt to distance him from views he does not hold. Rather, it reflects Plato's method of transposing Orphic material. Plato frequently incorporates such content indirectly, using phrases like ancient or sacred discourse, or a story told in the mysteries, to signal the source in a roundabout manner. The myth opens by describing the time of Cronus, when men were judged on the day of their death by other living men, who could hear testimonies on their behalf. Those deemed to have led just and holy lives were sent to the Isles of the Blessed, while the unjust and impious were confined to the dungeon of vengeance, called Tartarus. The judges, however, were fallible, often sending unworthy souls to the blessed and righteous souls to Tartarus. To prevent these errors, Zeus decreed that men would no longer know the day of their death in advance, and that, after death, souls should be judged naked, stripped of their bodies, by naked judges, so that the body would not interfere with the process. From that point forward, the souls of the dead were judged in a meadow at the entrance to Hades, where the roads diverged to the Isles of the Blessed or to Tartarus. 3 judges presided, Rhadamanthus for those arriving from Asia, Aeacus for those coming from Europe, and Minos for cases on which the other 2 could not decide. Plato frequently alludes to the kingdom of Cronus, portraying it as a kind of lost paradise where humans lived free from toil and suffering, including the pains of childbirth, and were governed by beings of a nobler and more divine race, called daimons. This myth, as Socrates notes in the Cratylus, originates from Hesiod, who describes a golden race of men living at the time of Cronus, to which belong the pure and benign spirits that roam the earth and watch over mortals. Hesiod's works and days also contain the earliest mention of the Isles of the Blessed, the realm where semi-divine heroes who survived the Theban and Trojan wars dwell without worry under the rule of Cronus. In this version of the myth, Cronus is not permanently imprisoned in Tartarus, unlike in Hesiod's Theogony or in the Iliad. A passage in Pindar's Second Olympian reflects an unmistakable affinity with Orphic thought. The helpless spirits of the dead pay the penalty for their personal crimes immediately, but for the offenses committed in the realm of Zeus, a judge beneath the earth delivers the sentence. The just enjoy a life of less toil, while the wicked endure suffering too terrible to behold. Those who have lived 3 times on both sides, keeping their souls free from injustice, follow the road of Zeus to the tower of Cronus, where the oceanic breezes surround the Isles of the Blessed. The meaning of these lines has been debated since antiquity. One interpretation sees Pindar as alluding to the ancestral crime of the Titans, whose penalty is incarnation. Thus, the souls of the dead are said to have paid the penalty right then and there, although this does not cleanse them of their ancient guilt. True atonement requires the acceptance of Persephone. Their personal crimes, by contrast, are judged and atoned for in the afterlife. Another explanation suggests that upon death, humans immediately pay the penalty in the weakening of their minds, which is itself the consequence of death. The eschatological vision conveyed by Pindar closely parallels the myth in the Gorgias, featuring the judgment of the dead, punishments for the wicked, and a pleasant existence for the righteous. Belief in post-mortem rewards and punishments was also central to the Orphic and Eleusinian traditions, although the extent to which personal conduct in life affected one's fate in the afterlife is not entirely clear. Existing sources emphasize initiation status as the key determinant. Most notably, the gold tablets indicate that identifying oneself as an initiate was seemingly the only condition for accessing the abode of the blessed. It is possible, however, that the absence of explicit soul judgment in these texts reflects their ritual function, serving as memory aids or identity tokens for deceased initiates to guide them to their rightful place in the underworld. The complaint in the Divinity text against those who disbelieve in the horrors of Hades implies the expectation that unatoned unjust acts in life will be punished after death. For the uninitiated, punishments such as lying in the mud or carrying water in broken vessels, though unpleasant, would not constitute true horrors. More seriously unjust souls, however, were believed to be punished according to the gravity of their crimes, enduring far greater suffering. Virtuous souls, by contrast, received rewards proportional to their deeds. Those who had lived free from wrongdoing 3 consecutive times in both earthly and otherworldly realms were permitted to travel the road to the Tower of Cronus and dwell forever in the Isles of the Blessed. The alternation between earthly and otherworldly lives, while not explicitly mentioned in the Gorgias, is a central element of Plato's conception of the afterlife and appears in Pindar's Second Olympian, suggesting that it was a feature of Orphic eschatology drawn upon by both authors. This is further corroborated in Plato's Laws, where mystery priests are described as holding that unjust individuals pay penalties twice, first in Hades and then in their next incarnation. A minor point of divergence between Pindar's and Plato's visions and the Orphic tradition concerns the location of the blessed abode. The sacred road described in the gold tablets leads not to the Isles of the Blessed, but to the holy meadows and groves of Persephone. This may be a nominal difference. In Homeric accounts, the Elysian plain, where Menelaus and Helen reside free of toil, and the groves of Persephone, marking Hades' entrance, both lie at the edge of the world beyond the river Ocean. It is therefore plausible that these various descriptions refer to the same general realm. If the idea of otherworldly punishments and rewards, even if reserved for a few exceptional cases, can be said to have a precedent in the epic tradition, the judgment of the dead appears largely absent from Homer, for whom most mortals, with few exceptions, share the same fate regardless of their actions on earth. The earliest reference to post-mortem judgment occurs in Pindar's Second Olympian, although the identity of the judge is unspecified. A few decades later, Aeschylus refers to the infernal judge as another Zeus in the Suppliants and as Hades in the Eumenides. Minos is mentioned as a judge in the Homeric Nicaea, but this reflects the continuation of his royal duties into the afterlife, resolving disputes among infernal residents, rather than implying systematic judgment of souls upon arrival in Hades. The exemplary sinners cited in the Nicaea are mythical figures punished by Zeus for defying his authority, and are not comparable to ordinary mortals, just as Menelaus and other heroes of the Golden Race were granted immortality by Zeus. Hesiod, however, contains implicit references to post-mortem reward and non-reward in the myth of the races. No source before Plato identifies Rhadamanthus and Aeacus as infernal judges, though Rhadamanthus appears in Euripides' Cyclops as a model of honesty, and Aeacus adjudicates disputes among gods in Pindar's 8th Isthmian. Pindar also refers to Rhadamanthus in the Second Olympian, describing virtuous souls in the Isles of the Blessed weaving wreaths of flowers according to his righteous counsel. Socrates' mention of Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, and Triptolemus in his final speech before the jury in the Apology suggests that the concept of infernal judges was already familiar to his audience. Given the close connection between the judgment of the dead and a differentiated afterlife, a hallmark of the Orphic tradition, it is plausible that the myth originated in eschatological poems ascribed to Orpheus or Musaeus. The inclusion of Triptolemus further implies a link, at least for Athenians, between post-mortem judgment and the Eleusinian mysteries. The pseudo-Platonic Axiochus, usually dated to the 1st century BCE, describes a special place in Hades reserved for those who successfully pass Minos and Rhadamanthus' interrogation regarding their conduct in life. Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, and Triptolemus are also mentioned in a fragmentary epitaph by Posidippus of Pella, where the deceased arrives at the abode of the blessed, to the sacred rites of the initiates, and to the pure fire before the house of Triptolemus. In another poem, Posidippus expresses a wish to travel the mystic path to Rhadamanthus in old age. A possible connection between this poet and an individual of the same name mentioned on a late 4th century BCE Orphic gold tablet from Pella suggests that he was likely an Orphic initiate himself. The Bologna papyrus also mentions the judgment of the dead, but its late date means it may have been influenced by Pindar's and Plato's descriptions of the afterlife. Although the only surviving Orphic source explicitly referring to the judgment of souls comes from the imperial age, A passage in the seventh epistle alludes to the ancient and sacred discourses on the immortality of the soul, the judgment of the dead, and the existence of punishments in the afterlife, lending support to this hypothesis. The dichotomy between body and soul, illustrated in the Gorgias myth by the contrast between a person's outward appearance and their moral character, reflects a distinctively Orphic idea, attested in ritual texts such as the 5th century bone tablets from Olbia. This concept is also echoed in metaphors depicting the body as a tomb or prison of the soul, which recur in several Platonic passages with an Orphic connotation. The belief that a dead person's soul retains not only physical features but also the wounds sustained in life is already present in the Odyssey, but Plato transforms this idea to refer to spiritual wounds caused by vice and injustice, which are revealed once the soul is no longer obscured by the body. Socrates explains to Polus that the only cure for the spiritual sickness resulting from wrongdoing is to receive just punishment. Failing to pay the penalty for one's misdeeds is the worst evil, worse even than unjust punishment, even if it leads to death. Underlying this is the Orphic view of life on earth as a stage of atonement from which it is forbidden to escape, for those who fail to purify themselves properly during life will face punishment in the next. For both Plato and the Orphics, true happiness can only be achieved in the afterlife, and the primary concern is the welfare of the soul. Yet, according to Plato, not all souls can be cured of spiritual sickness. In the Gorgias myth, the souls of incurable sinners, whose crimes are too severe to be atoned for, endure eternal punishment in Tartarus, serving as a cautionary example to others. The presence of these exemplary sinners implies a belief in reincarnation, since the curable sinners must be dissuaded from future wrongdoing. Some scholars, however, argue that the mere therapeutic effect of observing exemplary sinners on other souls suffices to justify their inclusion in the myth, making a theory of reincarnation unnecessary. Another possibility is the notion of internal mobility in the afterlife, a feature seen explicitly in the eschatological vision of the Phaedo. There is no need to choose among these explanations, as all could coexist. Nonetheless, the interpretation linking exemplary sinners to reincarnation should not be lightly dismissed, particularly given that Plato explicitly references the theory of reincarnation in the roughly contemporary Meno. Plato also had reason to omit reincarnation from the final myth of the Gorgias. Its purpose is to create urgency in Callicles, persuading him to care for his soul by pursuing philosophy rather than political power. Socrates emphasizes that virtuous men are rare among those in positions of authority, which is why tyrants, kings, dynasts, and politicians constitute the majority of incurable sinners condemned to eternal punishment in Tartarus. Only the philosopher, living a life devoted to truth and virtue, is assured a place among the blessed in the afterlife. Including the cycle of reincarnations here would have weakened the finality of the argument, undermining Socrates' aim of instilling the fear of post-mortem judgment to redirect his interlocutor toward the care of his soul. The eschatological myth, at the conclusion of the Phaedo, follows a series of logical arguments supporting the immortality of the soul and serves a function similar to the final myth in the Gorgias. However, whereas the latter aimed to frighten Socrates' interlocutor into pursuing philosophy, the Phaedo myth seeks to reassure Socrates' disciples about the fate that awaits the philosopher's soul after death. According to the myth, after leaving the body, the soul is guided by its daimon to the place where the dead await judgment, namely, the meadow at the entrance of Hades described in the Gorgias. After receiving its sentence, the guide whose job it is to bring to Hades those who come from this world escorts the soul to its place of punishment or reward, according to its past conduct. When the appointed time ends, another guide returns it to the meadow from which it first departed. Socrates remarks that the road to Hades seems neither simple nor single, for otherwise there would be no need for guides. A comparable vision of the afterlife is found in the Orphic gold tablets, some of which, like the one from Hipponion, provide detailed instructions for reaching the special place reserved for initiates. There is a spring on the right, and standing next to it a white cypress. Do not even go near this spring. Ahead you will find cold water pouring forth from the lake of memory, and you too, having drunk, will walk down the sacred path on which other glorious initiates and Bacchae travel. A parallel for the daimons that escort souls from the living world to the realm of the dead may be found in the eschatological section of the Derveni Papyrus, which appears to allude to the idea that everyone is assigned a daimon. The Divini author seems to distinguish between beneficial daimons, possibly the Eumenides, and harmful ones, associated with a particular category of souls, perhaps those who died violently, who can obstruct newly deceased souls from reaching the happy abode of the initiates. According to one interpretation of the first columns of the Divini papyrus, these obstructing daimons, possibly identified with the Erinyes, were transformed into Eumenides after the Magoi, or other religious experts employing techniques attributed to the Magoi, paid the penalty on behalf of the initiates. The main precedent for Plato's spirit guides, and possibly for the personal daimons mentioned in the Divini papyrus, if the reading is correct, appears to be the widespread folk belief in tutelary spirits that accompany individuals from birth to death, not unlike the guardian angels of later Christian tradition, a notion well attested in ancient sources. The judgment of the dead, central to the eschatological myth in the Gorgias, is only briefly mentioned in the Phaedo myth, which instead provides a detailed account of the other world, framed within a broader geographical excursus on the nature and size of the earth and its many marvelous regions. According to Socrates, contrary to popular belief, humans do not live on the earth's surface but within its cavities, while the heavenly region above, the true earth, is inhabited by gods and righteous souls. The hollows closer to the surface are where humans dwell. The largest and deepest cavity is Tartarus, where the souls of the wicked endure punishment for their crimes, with all the subterranean rivers, most notably Oceanus, Acheron, Pyriphlegethon, and Cocytus, flowing into this chasm. While the names of these 4 infernal rivers appear briefly in Homer's Odyssey, Plato likely drew on a different source for his detailed description. A resemblance between a particular phrase in this section of the Phaedo and an Orphic verse repeatedly cited by Neoplatonists suggests that the source, vaguely alluded to by Socrates, may have been an Orphic eschatological poem. The subterranean cavities in the myth are compared to mixing bowls, prompting the hypothesis that Plato's source could have been the crater, a lost Orphic Pythagorean poem mentioned in Orphic literature catalogues, though no fragments survive, leaving its content speculative. A notable difference between Homeric and Orphic eschatology and Platonic eschatology concerns the location of the abode of the blessed. In Homeric and Orphic traditions, it is a place on or below the surface of the earth, whereas the Phaedo myth describes it as islands surrounded by air, since water in the underground hollows corresponds to air in the true earth above. The imperfect nature of the visible world leads Plato to place virtuous souls on a higher plane than impure souls, while the world of the living occupies the same level as Hades, where impure souls are punished. This conception reflects the Orphic view that human souls inhabit bodies to atone for ancestral guilt, making life on earth comparable to imprisonment or death. The eschatological section of the Phaedo thus carries metaphysical significance beyond the myth itself, which is why Plato devotes extensive attention to the description of the earth. After this extensive digression, Socrates proceeds to describe the fate of souls once they have been judged. In addition to the distinction between righteous and unjust souls, already outlined in the Gorgias, Plato introduces another category: souls that have neither been notably wicked nor notably virtuous, who reside in a form of purgatory in the Acherusian lake. Their condition recalls the uninitiated in the Orphic vision of the afterlife, who are said to lie in the mire, although, for Plato, the punishment each soul receives is proportional to its wrongdoings. As explained in the Gorgias, wicked souls are further divided into curable and incurable. Both serve their sentences in Tartarus, but the incurable, including those who have committed numerous grave acts of sacrilege or heinous murders, remain there eternally, while the curable are transferred to the Acherusian lake after a year, provided they persuade their victims to forgive them. The model is further complicated by the Phaedo's eschatological myth, which posits a distinction within the intelligible world, the place where righteous souls dwell before reincarnation, and the even more beautiful abodes, where souls who have purified themselves through philosophy live forever without bodies. These even more beautiful abodes, rather than the habitations on the true earth, correspond to the intelligible realm in the allegory of the cave. This complexity arises from Plato's attempt to reconcile the two-world metaphysical distinction of visible and intelligible realms with the four-world eschatological scheme of earthly existence, Elysium, Tartarus, and the celestial plane. Righteous souls are also divided into two groups: those who have purified themselves through philosophy, and those who have led virtuous lives without philosophical practice. The latter dwell in the Isles of the Blessed for a time before returning to earth in a new body, while the former remain forever in the even more beautiful abodes, existing without bodies. The precise nature of these dwellings is described in the eschatological section of the Phaedrus, which will be examined next. If there is a Platonic dialogue that rivals the Phaedo in the number of Orphic references, it is undoubtedly the Phaedrus. The Orphic influence is most apparent in the central portion of the dialogue, which presents a mythical account of the soul's fall. In this myth, the human soul is depicted as a winged chariot with a charioteer. Of the two horses drawing the chariot, one is of noble character, while the other is the opposite. The correspondence between the charioteer and the two horses on one hand, and the three parts of the soul, the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive, on the other, is evident. Yet applying this tripartite structure to the pure soul, which has not yet united with the body, appears to contradict the theory in the Phaedo and the Republic, according to which the imperfections of the human soul arise from its union with the body. Some scholars have suggested that this reflects a radical development in Plato's psychology. However, the Timaeus describes the spirited and appetitive parts as appendages added to the rational soul to support its existence in a physical body, primarily to perform the essential functions needed to preserve life. Plato himself encourages a comparison between the Timaeus and the eschatological myth of the Phaedrus, noting that when the world soul was divided into individual souls corresponding to the stars, each soul was assigned to its respective star and mounted there as in a chariot, being shown the nature of the universe and the laws of destiny. One way to resolve the apparent contradiction is to consider that the chariot myth describes a subsequent fall of the soul rather than its original descent. Yet this is difficult to reconcile with the statement at the end of the Phaedo myth that all souls purified through philosophy live forever without bodies in a place even more beautiful than the Isles of the Blessed. In the Phaedrus, only the philosopher's soul can regain its wings and return to the heavenly abodes, implying that souls who reach these even more beautiful abodes are not subjected to a second fall. Another approach would be to treat the Phaedrus myth as presenting an alternative eschatology, though the strong similarities between this myth and those in the Gorgias, Phaedo, and Republic argue against this position. In the chariot myth, as long as the human soul retains its wings, it dwells with the gods in the sky, participating as fully as it can in the contemplation of true being. True being, being the object of knowledge, is visible only to the mind, the pilot of the soul, and provides nourishment to the gods and to every soul capable of receiving what is proper to it. The soul's capacity to share in this vision depends on its ability to control the two horses, the parts of the soul susceptible to earthly passions and desires. If, through mischance, the soul becomes filled with evil and forgetfulness and grows heavy, it loses its wings and falls to earth. The reference to forgetfulness draws attention to the plane of truth, where the forms reside, and highlights the theme of memory and forgetfulness. This theme, prominent in the Orphic gold tablets, plays a crucial role in the eschatological myth of the Republic, where the otherworldly plane of forgetfulness is introduced. The fallen soul is first incarnated in a human body, but may assume an animal form in subsequent lives, as described in the Phaedo and the Timaeus. Reincarnation was a central tenet of the Orphic Pythagorean tradition, but Plato adapts it by establishing a hierarchy in which human souls who misbehave in their first earthly life are punished by being reborn in a lower form. Likewise, Plato assigns newly incarnated souls to different kinds of lives according to their knowledge of true being. Those who have spent the most time contemplating the forms become philosophers, while those who have spent the least become tyrants. The sequence of lives described is not a ladder that souls climb or descend based on merit, but a mythical depiction of Plato's social and moral hierarchy. At the top are philosophers, followed by lawful kings and warlike rulers, statesmen and businessmen, athletes, mystery priests, poets, craftsmen, sophists and demagogues, and finally tyrants. Plato's ranking of lawful kings immediately below lovers of wisdom and beauty aligns closely with the Pindaric fragment, which describes how souls from whom Persephone accepts atonement for the ancient wrong are reborn as glorious kings and men of surpassing wisdom, and are thereafter regarded as holy heroes. The fragment's Orphic affinities are signaled by the reference to the ancient crime, likely the ancestral guilt inherited from the Titans, who, according to Orphic myth, killed Dionysus, Persephone's son, and consumed his flesh. Whether the promise of rebirth as a king derives from the Orphic Mysteries or Pindar himself is unclear, but a parallel appears in the Petelia gold tablet, which states that the initiate will rule among the other heroes after drinking from the lake of memory. After completing their earthly life, souls are brought to judgment and sent either to the places of punishment under the earth or to a heavenly region, depending on their deeds. No mention is made here of incurable sinners who suffer eternally in Tartarus, as in other eschatological myths, but this omission is unremarkable, since Plato frequently leaves out details that are not essential to the immediate context, as in the final myth of the Gorgias, which does not discuss the cycle of rebirths. After 1,000 years since incarnation, the soul chooses its next life. This cycle continues until the soul regains its wings, normally achievable only after a minimum of 10 incarnations, or 10,000 years since its original fall from heaven. An exception is made for souls that have lived on earth as philosophers 3 consecutive times, which allows them to regain their wings after just 3,000 years. The Orphic character of the passage in the Phaedrus is undeniable. The eschatology presented here by Plato closely resembles that of Pindar's second Olympian, as both rely on the alternation between earthly incarnations and periods of reward or punishment in the afterlife. Another indication of Orphic Pythagorean influence appears in the repeated use of the number 3 and its square. There are 9 levels in the hierarchy of human incarnations, and 9,000 years is the minimum time the soul spends in the other world before regaining its wings, divided into 10 non-consecutive intervals of at least 900 years each. For the philosopher, this duration is reduced to 3,000 years, comprising 3 lives on earth of roughly 100 years each and 3 lives in the abode of the blessed, each lasting at least 900 years. Similarly, Pindar states that a soul is released from the cycle of reincarnations after living without fault 3 times in both places, meaning on earth and in Hades. The number 3 was regarded by the Pythagoreans as perfect because it embodies beginning, middle, and end. It is possible that in Pindar's fragment the term for year refers to a great year, suggesting that the soul's stay in Hades could be understood as 9,000 years instead of 9. The prospect of a 9,000-year reward would likely have seemed daunting to Pindar's audience, explaining why the period was reduced to 9 years. It is also conceivable that Pindar derived the number 9 from another source, such as Hesiod's Theogony, where gods who swear by the Styx are exiled for 9 years. Elsewhere, Pindar says that souls pardoned by Persephone return to earth as glorious kings after 9 years. Whether a year in Hades equals a year on earth is unclear. If it does, one might conclude either that Plato multiplied Pindar's 9 by 1,000 or, more plausibly, that Pindar reduced an Orphic figure of 9,000 to 9. Empedocles, whose affinity with Orphism is well known, asserts that fallen souls must wander away from their heavenly abode for 30,000 seasons, equivalent to 10,000 years, which aligns with Plato's minimum period for non-philosophical souls to escape the cycle of rebirth. Additionally, Herodotus reports an Egyptian doctrine of reincarnation in which a complete cycle lasts 3,000 years, and notes that certain unnamed Greeks also adopted this theory, most likely referring to the Orphics and Pythagoreans. This view is further supported by Hecataeus of Abdera, who affirms that Orpheus brought the mysteries of Dionysus from Egypt. Returning to the Phaedrus myth, another possible Orphic reference is suggested by the name Plato uses for the hierarchy of incarnations, the law of Adrastea. Empedocles refers to the law governing the cycle of rebirths as the decree of necessity. The identification of Ananke with Adrastea, who was equated with Nemesis in the 5th century BC, became common among the Stoics from at least the 3rd century BC and seems implied by Plato, who in the myth of Air assigns to Ananke the role of overseeing reincarnation. A Stoic commentator later interpreted Adrastea as an adjective meaning inevitable, derived from a verb meaning to run away. Although the explicit identification of Adrastea with Ananke is not attested in Orphic sources before late antiquity, it is conceivable that this etymology could have originated in an ancient Orphic source, perhaps an allegorical commentary like that preserved in the Derveni papyrus, known to both Empedocles and Plato. Further confirmation of the Orphic character of the Phaedrus myth appears at its close, where Socrates compares philosophy, understood as the recollection of the forms, to initiation into the mysteries. Only the mind of the philosopher grows wings, for he is continually, to the best of his ability, in communion through memory with those things whose communion renders God divine. By properly using these reminders, a man is constantly initiated into perfect mysteries, and alone becomes truly perfect. The elaborate wordplay is significant. The adjective meaning perfect, and the verb meaning to fulfill, both derive from the noun for end, or fulfillment, from which the term for mystery rite or initiation also comes. The repetition of perfect, first describing the internal object and then the subject, emphasizes the idea of perfection, closely linked with initiation. By using the present tense, Plato underscores the continuous and progressive nature of philosophical initiation, which extends throughout life and beyond. True perfection is only achieved by the pure, rational soul once it finally breaks free from the cycle of reincarnations. Plato continues the comparison between philosophy and the mysteries with a vision of true beauty experienced by souls in the Hyperuranian. At that time, they behold beauty in its splendor and are initiated into the most blessed mysteries, as when they were whole, winged, and untouched by future evils, reaching the highest level of initiation by contemplating simple, unchanging, and blessed visions in pure light, being pure themselves and not entombed in the body, imprisoned like oysters. The mystic, specifically Eleusinian, undertone is signaled by the emphasis on light and vision, and by technical terms referring to the two levels of Eleusinian initiation. The stress on purity and the notion of the soul as entombed or imprisoned in the body are clear Orphic references that recur in Plato. Here, the body as tomb or prison is complemented by the oyster metaphor, where the shell represents the protective function of the body, and the oyster, an animal without memory, symbolizes the human soul, whose recollection of the forms has been suppressed. Although every human soul retains some memory of the forms, few are able to achieve sufficient recollection of them. Only those who follow the path of philosophy for 3 consecutive incarnations are permitted to return to the place where the gods and other pure souls dwell. This aligns with the Orphic Creed, according to which only the Bacoi, those initiated into the Orphic mysteries and living according to Orphic precepts, gain access to the seats of the blessed and are freed from the cycle of rebirths. Plato seems to reflect this view in the Phaedo, where he compares philosophy to the mysteries. The soul that arrives purified and initiated dwells with the gods, for, as the mysteries say, many are the thesis bearers, but the Bacoi few, and these are, in Plato's view, those who have properly practiced philosophy. Given this, the common interpretation that, in the Phaedrus myth, all souls regain their wings after 10,000 years regardless of their purity appears untenable. If souls must reach a certain level of purity to return to their heavenly home, as Plato implies, they will not face a second fall, as the Phaedo makes clear. Accepting the chariot myth as an account of an original fall presents difficulties for Plato's theory of the soul, since it would require applying the tripartite structure to a soul that has never entered a body. Taken literally, the myth seems to suggest this, as even divine souls are described as having 3 parts, though in their case all parts are perfectly harmonious. It seems reasonable, however, to conclude that the tripartite depiction in the chariot myth serves the allegory rather than reflecting the innate nature of the soul. Other passages, including the Timaeus, clarify that the composite nature of the human soul arises only through incarnation. The immortal principle of soul is given a mortal body as its vehicle, and within that body resides a mortal soul subject to necessary, though often troubling, passions. While the Timaeus presents the soul's first incarnation as part of the demiurge's creative design, with no negative moral connotation, the eschatological context of the Phaedrus myth frames incarnation as punishment or at least an undesirable consequence. In this context, the soul's fall must result from some error or fault on its part, yet Plato deliberately remains silent on the precise nature of this mischance. A possible explanation is that Plato did not need to invent a reason for the soul's original fall, since a mythical account already existed in the Orphic tradition, likely familiar to his audience. According to the cardinal myth of Orphism, humans were created from the ashes of the Titans, who had been incinerated by Zeus for murdering and devouring the infant Dionysus. Because of this ancestral guilt, human souls are condemned to the cycle of generation, from which they can escape only by purifying themselves through the proper initiation rites. Another, not necessarily alternative, Explanation is that Plato may have conceived the original fall not as a consequence of moral wrongdoing, but as a necessary step in the creation of the universe, a notion suggested in the Timaeus. In any case, the Orphic subtext of the Phaedrus myth demonstrates that its vision of the afterlife is fully compatible with other eschatological myths, including the myth of air. The final myth of the Republic can be seen as the culmination of Plato's afterlife narratives, as well as the endpoint of his long argument across 10 books on why justice is preferable to injustice. This myth has drawn criticism from many scholars, who find its connection with the rest of the dialogue problematic. A balanced critique, which dismisses some of the superficial claims about perceived inconsistencies, has been offered by Onas, who considers the ending of the Republic unsatisfying and poorly harmonized, though not fundamentally incompatible with the work as a whole. The focus here is not on aesthetic or moral judgments of the myth, but rather on its meaning and its relation to other major eschatological passages in Plato's corpus, particularly the Gorgias. The Republic myth, it will be argued, fits within the same Orphic framework that shapes the eschatologies of the Gorgias, Phaedo, and Phaedrus, representing the climax and synthesis of the argumentative threads developed over the 10 books. The myth of air recounts the story of the Pamphylian soldier who, like Orpheus, returned from the land of the dead to describe his experiences, as the myth indicates, by the will of the gods. After Air's death on the battlefield, his soul arrives at a marvelous place, later described as a meadow, with 2 openings in the earth and 2 above in the sky. Between the 2 holes in the ground sit the infernal judges. Virtuous souls are sent up and to the right to the heavenly abode of the blessed, while the wicked are sent down and to the left to Tartarus. This marvelous place, where souls await judgment, corresponds, as suggested by some scholars, to the true earth described in the Phaedo, the world above the surface of the earth, in contrast with the underground hollows where humans dwell according to the mythical topography of the Phaedo. At the end of the 1,000-year interval between one incarnation and the next, the souls destined for reincarnation return to the meadow through the opening opposite the one by which they first entered, presumably to avoid obstructing the flow of incoming souls. There they remain for 7 days, and on the 8th day, they begin their journey to the place where they will select their next life. On the 4th day of this journey, they encounter a pillar of light, described as similar to a rainbow but brighter and purer. This is the axis around which the universe revolves, and within it hangs the spindle of necessity. The visible structure of the universe, or rather of the hemisphere accessible to the souls, is comparable to a spindle with 8 concentric whorls instead of 1. The shaft passes through the Earth's poles, while the whorls correspond to the celestial spheres. Along the rims of the whorls are fixed stars, the 5 known planets, the Sun and the Moon, and on each rim sits a siren, each singing a note of an octave. After 1 additional day, the souls reach the pillar of light where necessity sits, turning her spindle. Around her, at equal intervals, sit her daughters, the white-robed fates, who sing in unison with the sirens and assist in turning the spindle. The interval from the soul's return from the place of punishment or reward to its arrival before necessity, the duration of Air's journey in the otherworld, totals 12 days, divided into 3 segments of 7, 4, and 1 day, respectively. These numbers clearly carry symbolic significance, though their precise meaning in the myth is not entirely transparent. The number 12 may allude to the 12 labors of Heracles, whose descent to Hades was recounted in an ancient Orphic poem. Stoic allegorical interpretation compared Heracles' labors to the 12 signs of the zodiac and his death on the funeral pyre to the cosmic ekpyrosis. The parallel with Air, who returns to life 12 days after his death as his body is cremated, appears too deliberate to be accidental. Plato and the Stoics may have drawn from a shared source, perhaps an Orphic Pythagorean poem or allegorical commentary. This connection between Air and Heracles was later noted by Clement of Alexandria, who linked the length of Air's underworld journey to the fact that the soul's path to ascension lies through the 12 signs of the zodiac, adding that the journey, after which the soul obtains release from this universe, is symbolized by the 12 labors of Heracles. Clement further related the 7 days the souls spend in the meadow to the motions of the 7 planets, and the 4 days from the meadow to the first sight of the pillar of light to the passage through the 4 elements, citing Hesiod's verse from the Works and Days. To start with, the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th, a holy day. In the same discussion, Clement identifies air with the Persian prophet Zoroaster, a connection traced back to the time of Colotes the Epicurean, who cited a pseudepigraphic work purporting to be Zoroaster's account of his journey to Hades. While the author of this work clearly borrowed from Plato's myth, and any connection between air and Zoroaster was likely unintentional on Plato's part, some scholars have suggested that Plato might have drawn inspiration from an ancient Persian source. If so, an Orphic mediation is plausible, given the known connections between early Orphism and the cult of the Magi. Perhaps even more significant are the numbers Plato does not explicitly mention, the hidden pairs of threes found in the differences between 7 and 4 and 4 and 1. At first glance, this might appear trivial, yet the parallel with the eschatologies of the Phaedrus and Pindar's second Olympian, where virtuous souls are rewarded after 3 consecutive lives in both places, on earth and in the other world, and the mystical importance of the number 3, suggest otherwise. The number 12 may also allude to the length of the Orphic Great Year, which was set at 120,000 years according to Censorinus. Given the cosmological and eschatological significance of the myth of air, it is plausible that Plato had all these references in mind. It is also reasonable to assume that Plato's emphasis on certain numbers and proportions was at least partly influenced by Pythagorean number theory, especially considering the distinctly Pythagorean tone of this section of the myth, exemplified by the reference to the doctrine of cosmic harmony. While the numerology behind the arrangement of the planets according to their velocities and relative distances will not be examined here, it is noteworthy that it is centered around the number 9, whose importance in Orphic eschatology has already been observed. The process by which souls select their next incarnation, only briefly mentioned in the eschatological myth of the Phaedrus, is elaborated here in considerable detail, with numerous references to figures from the epic tradition. The first is Orpheus, who, unwilling to be conceived by a woman because of the violence that led to his death, chooses the life of a swan. Given the swan's Apollan symbolism, this likely reflects Orpheus' decision to honor Apollo Helios over Dionysus, provoking the wrath of Dionysus' followers. There is no hint of sarcasm in this choice. Rather, when compared with a passage from the Phaedo, in which Socrates praises the swan as a prophetic animal and aligns himself with Apollo, a subtle parallel emerges between Orpheus and Plato's Socrates. Souls, following an order determined by lot, select their next life from a set of predetermined options far greater than the number of souls, ensuring that each has a fair chance. This system carries the greatest risk for human souls. Non-philosophers, especially those who have not endured the punishments of Tartarus, may be seduced by wealth or power into choosing a life of vice, potentially even that of a tyrant, leading to eternal suffering. At first, the choice of lives in the myth of air may seem to conflict with the theory of reincarnation presented in other dialogues, such as the Phaedo and the Timaeus, where a soul's next incarnation is determined by its conduct in the previous life. Yet, the myth of air is fully compatible with these passages and is equally, if not more, deterministic despite its emphasis on choice and personal responsibility. The myth explicitly illustrates how a soul's experiences, not only in its prior incarnation but also in the other world, shape its choice of the next life. Only souls that have practiced philosophy are capable of choosing rationally at every step, avoiding the temptations of material desire or ambition. This interpretation finds support in the eschatological myth of the Phaedrus, where the emphasis is placed on knowledge and memory. A soul's first incarnation is determined, according to the law of adrastia, by the length of time it has spent contemplating the forms. It is strongly suggested that the choice of the next incarnation, briefly mentioned, is likewise influenced by the degree to which the soul can recollect the knowledge gained from that contemplation. In the myth of air, the proclamation preceding the selection of lives, the word of Lachesis, states that souls are responsible for choosing their own fate and may, at any moment, acquire a greater or lesser share of virtue by either honoring or dishonoring her. This statement does not celebrate free will so much as it underscores the sobering reality that humans alone are accountable for any evil that befalls them, for, in Plato's words, the guilt lies with him who chooses. God is blameless. Plato appears to fluctuate between explanations for why only a select few can become philosophers. In the Republic, innate human differences are described in quasi-biological terms, with the creation of distinct psychological types. gold, silver, and iron and brass, which are largely heritable. While the myth of metals should not be taken literally, and the text allows for exceptions, a sense of biological determinism is evident. In the Phaedrus, intellectual differences among souls are attributed to the time each soul spent contemplating the forms, a factor that varies individually. This is facilitated by the ambiguity of the chariot myth, which leaves it unclear whether it recounts the original fall or a subsequent one. The Timaeus clarifies that all human souls experienced their first incarnation simultaneously and began with the same knowledge, indicating that individual differences are shaped not by God, but by the soul's conduct across multiple lives. After selecting its next incarnation and being assigned a daimon as guardian and fulfiller of its chosen path, the soul finalizes its destiny by passing beneath the throne of necessity. This imagery, symbolizing the soul's re-entry into the sensible world, recalls the rite of rebirth in the Orphic Mysteries, referenced in one of the gold tablets from Thurii, where the initiate describes having plunged beneath the lap of Persephone. Once all souls have made their choice, they proceed together to the plain of Lethe, where they are overcome by a terrible and suffocating heat. They are then made to drink from the river of forgetfulness, whose waters no vessel can hold. This recalls the Gorgias, in which the mindless or uninitiated soul is likened to a leaky jar, unable to retain anything due to disbelief and forgetfulness. In this allegory, itself based on the Orphic myth of the water carriers, the uninitiated souls who fail to purify themselves through the mysteries spend their time in the underworld carrying water in broken pitchers. Similarly, the water of the river of forgetfulness fills every soul with oblivion, rendering it like a leaky jar. No soul, not even that of a philosopher, is immune. The wisest drink sparingly, but most, overcome by thirst, drink without restraint. Once all the souls are asleep, they are suddenly taken up to their next birth like shooting stars. Only Air, who was forbidden from drinking, retains the memory of these events upon awakening in his old body. A comparison with the texts of the gold tablets shows that this final section of the myth is saturated with Orphic imagery. The heat-induced thirst experienced by the souls and the water of forgetfulness, though not explicitly named in the tablets, are implicitly referenced by the advice for initiates to avoid the first spring they encounter and instead drink from the lake of memory. The analogy between souls returning to Earth for reincarnation and shooting stars may also carry an Orphic meaning, reflecting a line from the Phaselis tablet where the initiate identifies himself as starry. The most important parallel between the myth of Air and the eschatology of the gold tablets is the central role of memory in the salvation of the soul. The Orphic gold tablets, described as the work or the gift of memory, serve to guide the souls of initiates to the abode of the blessed, reminding them of the formulas and passwords needed for the guardians and infernal gods. In Plato, this purpose is fulfilled by philosophy. Only the proper practice of philosophy, involving separation from the body and cultivation of memory of the forms, can safeguard the soul from evil on earth and in Hades, eventually allowing it to escape the cycle of reincarnations. The precise function of the lake of memory in the gold tablets is less clear. It may ensure that the souls of initiates retain a sense of self, which would be lost without memory of past experiences, or simply preserve the mental faculties necessary to enjoy a blissful existence in the afterlife, since, according to Homeric eschatology, souls in Hades lack any consciousness. Drinking from the water of forgetfulness condemns the soul to the fate of the uninitiated. Similarly, in the myth of Air, it causes souls to forget their experiences in the afterlife and previous incarnations before moving on to the next life. The wisest souls, however, restrain themselves, drinking as little as possible to preserve knowledge, including presumably the knowledge of the forms acquired in the Hyperuranian before the original fall. The myth of Air represents the most complete illustration of Plato's vision of the afterlife, synthesizing all his earlier eschatological accounts. It combines the judgment of the soul from the Gorgias, the geography of the Phaedo, and the theory of reincarnation from the Phaedrus, while introducing the theme of the choice of life, which is central to the myth and underlies the entire dialogue. All major thematic threads of the Republic converge in the myth of Air. The story of Gorgias, exemplifying the choice between a perfectly just and perfectly unjust life, is explicitly referenced in the introduction to the myth, along with Homer and Hesiod, the main subjects of Plato's critique of traditional poetry in earlier books. By dismissing conventional stories of the afterlife, Plato provides his own catabasis, not a tale of Alcinous, but a philosophical myth richly infused with Orphic imagery. This final eschatological myth is foreshadowed at key moments throughout the dialogue, beginning with the very opening words, which, according to tradition, Plato continued to revise until his death. The discussion on the nature of justice is sparked by Cephalus' remarks on old age and the fear of punishment in the afterlife, which motivate honest men to fulfill their obligations to both gods and humans. The allegory of the cave, often regarded as the central myth of the Republic, functions as a reverse catabasis, with evident echoes of the eschatological geography described in the myth of the Phaedo. In essence, the Republic builds toward the vision of cosmic justice in the myth of air, where virtue is always rewarded, and tyrannical souls face eternal punishment. While human justice is fallible, giving the appearance that undetected wrongdoing is more profitable than virtue, divine justice is unfailing. Yet the myth illustrates that virtue alone does not guarantee a positive outcome. Habit without philosophy cannot shield the soul from the harmful influence of passions, which often lead otherwise virtuous individuals to choose a life of vice. This caution underscores the necessity of caring for the soul through philosophy, and absolves the gods from blame for any suffering experienced by virtuous men. Humans can choose at any time to honor virtue, reaping immediate benefits for their souls both in life and after death, but they must still face the consequences of past choices. While this vision of cosmic justice is uncompromising, it is not indifferent to individual moral achievement. The gods reward moral behavior, ensure every soul has a fair chance in selecting its next life, and provide the possibility of pursuing virtue and philosophy to improve one's fate, the only exceptions being tyrants and supremely unjust individuals. The absence of mention of permanent release from reincarnation in the myth of air is explained by the story's framing as a personal account from the protagonist's perspective, who would not know that certain souls completing 3 life cycles in philosophy do not return to the earthly realm. Plato frequently omits details not immediately relevant to the focus of a passage, which in the myth of air is the question of personal choice within reincarnation. This perspective is no more pessimistic than the view in other eschatological myths, such as the Gorgias, where the lack of reference to reincarnation conveys the finality of punishment for unjust souls. Ultimately, Plato's eschatological myths provide the spiritual foundation for his philosophical project, emphasizing the primacy of the invisible over the sensible. The seemingly deterministic nature of his cosmos is tempered by the benevolence of the gods, who grant humans the opportunity to improve their lot and, ultimately, escape the cycle of rebirths through initiation into the perfect mysteries of philosophy.